I'm Kari Borne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater, and we come over here to Fairhaven Senior Services each Monday in the semester to host the lecture series. We've been doing so since 1983. This semester, we're talking about remarkable women, and so we have some good stories for you today of some women in philanthropy. Today's presenter is Ruth K. Hansen. She is an associate professor at UW-Whitewater's College of Business and Economics and director of the Institute for Nonprofit Management Studies. A scholar and former practitioner, she brings over 2 decades of fundraising experience to her research on philanthropy and inclusion in the nonprofit sector. Dr. Hansen's work explores the intersection of theory and practice in fundraising, how we ask, who gives to whom, and why it matters. She currently serves as chair of the Research Council for the AFP Foundation for Fundraising. Dr. Hansen was named a 2024 AFP Early Career Emerging Scholar. In fall of 2025, she will deliver the 5th annual Dame Shirley Lecture at the University of Kent, Canterbury's Center on Philanthropy, joining a distinguished line of speakers shaping the global discourse on philanthropy. Please welcome Dr. Ruth Hansen.
Well, thank you very much. And that was a lot of big words, wasn't it? And you might expect that somebody using so many big words might be able to navigate their way around the streets. So a little bit of humility just to start off. But I'm very pleased to be here with you, very pleased to be talking about women in America's philanthropic tradition. When I saw that the theme this year was remarkable women, of course, my training is in philanthropy. So I started thinking about all of the women I'd come across, and it really is a distinctive story. So today, we're going to be focusing mostly on a historical context. Now, I have been told that there are many members of the faculty who have retired and live here, so I just want to check my audience here. Anybody from the history department? Okay, all right. I'm sorry? You're safe. I'm safe. Okay, good. The stories can begin. No, they're good to begin with. So we're really going to be looking at this from a historical lens. We're going to be looking at it from a lens of how women's engagement in philanthropy helped shape the way the United States developed, which I think is a darn cool story. And it's also cool because by engaging in philanthropy, women were able to kind of cross the boundaries of what was maybe not legally allowed as an individual, but by being a leadership position in an organization, could hold property, could direct the use of funds. So it really opened some doors and was a mutual development. And then after we talk about just focusing on these 3 main areas, literacy, settlement houses, and the development of social science, just touch a little bit on what philanthropy looks like today and the role of women in today's philanthropy. And then I'd love to hear what you see when looking at all of this put together, because fresh eyes are always a good thing. So I want to start off with a definition. Philanthropy. There's lots of different ways to think about what does philanthropy mean. Many people probably think in terms of writing a check, which is definitely philanthropy. You might think in terms of volunteering for an organization or a project, also philanthropy. I go by this definition. Philanthropy is voluntary action for the common good. So what does this mean? It means you don't have to do it. You're choosing to do it. And it benefits an audience that's greater than just you or your kids, even though your kids may be the world to you, right? It is for the common good. Well, what is the common good? By this definition, whoever is doing the giving, whether it's time or treasure, we hear about that, or expertise, gets to decide what they think is in the common good, in the interests of the common good. So let's start with literacy, and the three areas going to really focus on here, particularly Sunday schools, kindergartens, and libraries. These are areas where we see a strong influence by women going back to, this is going back to the late 1700s. Now these four ladies here, I believe I have identified them in the correct order. Elizabeth Ann Seton, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. I don't know if anybody in here adores Hamilton, the musical, quite as much as I do. At the end of the musical, after the duel, which, spoiler alert, Burr shoots Hamilton. At the end, there's so much of an emphasis throughout the musical on who will tell your story. And Elizabeth Schuyler talks about how she helped found an orphanage. Well, it was part of this group of women, Joanna Bethune and Isabella Graham. Now, Isabella Graham was born in Scotland and was very active in society and doing philanthropic work in Scotland. And after the revolution, she received an invitation from the Reverend Witherspoon. Anybody in here a fan of 1776? I should just warn you at this point that I also tend to see history through the eyes of Broadway musicals. Okay, 1776, of course, tells the story of the signing of the Declaration, and at one point we have the Reverend James Witherspoon from New Jersey coming in. Well, it turns out he's not just a character in a musical, he really existed. He used to be the president of Princeton after the Revolution, and he invited Mrs. Graham to come to New York City with her daughter, Joanna Bethune. I believe she picked up the Bethune surname here in the States. And this was, to call her a civic-minded person is to put it mildly. No sooner had she landed on the shores of New York than she opened a school for girls. So this is a point at which not everybody's even getting an education, right? And in 1793, these four together opened the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children, the New York Orphan Asylum that Eliza sings of at the end of Hamilton. But wait, you might be saying, what does this have to do with literacy? Well, because the idea of education as a means for bettering one's prospects. The idea that it is something that if you are born poor, if you lose your parents, if you have no family, an education can help you get ahead with life. Now, so much of society at this point was organized through churches, and it was so common for there to be an overlap between, say, the reverend who is the head of Princeton, or the clergy members who are on the board of Harvard, and the local government too, right? So, Isabella and Joanna go to their local church, and they petition to open a Sabbath school. The idea being, how can people read the Bible if they can't read? So we're going to combine the basic literacy, the ability to read, with also Bible study. Well, the quote up there comes from Joanna's husband, because you can see that they started the school in 1827. She started lobbying for the school in 1820, trying to work through existing channels. after a while, her husband, who was an elder at the church, said, "Stop waiting. Get yourself some women together and begin the work yourselves." So 1827, they start essentially a Sunday school where they are teaching children to read. Over the next 10 years, they established a total of 10 schools, and they wound up educating 6,000 children. This was down the Five Points neighborhood of New York, which, I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit of a turn from Broadway musicals here. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, I'm not going to suggest it'll give you nightmares, but it was set in this Five Points neighborhood where she was teaching these children. Well, why does establishing one Sunday school get you a slide in a presentation in 2025? Because this movement took off. Women who were, particularly women from the Northeast who were affiliated with churches, began to say, hey, let's do this. And it spread west. And it combined with the idea of kindergartens. Sunday schools, the idea was basically brought over largely from Scotland, the idea of having school to teach religion that also taught you how to read so that you could read the Bible. From Germany, we get the idea of a kindergarten, and these two ideas combined. And again, these were seen as something that was, even though it's for the Sunday schools, we're talking the late 1700s, the early 1800s. By the late 1900s, the early 20th century, we have these women largely working through church networks saying, let's establish these kindergartens so that we can give children an early leg up. Oh, and by the way, and so these pictures here, the one on the left is from the Calumet Historical Archive in Gary, Indiana. And that is a picture of what became Gary Neighborhood House, and it was started as a kindergarten. It was started by two sisters who were in the Presbyterian Church further east in Indiana, in what was considered to be, civilized territory, opening up a kindergarten in Gary, which was considered like the Wild West. In 1906, I believe they started this. I think the picture's from 1907. And you might chuckle at that, but when they started it, they went to go see the site and select it. The town was newly settled, as you would know if you watched The Music Man. The town was newly settled as a company town for U.S. Steel. But they only built up the company town for the managers, for the people, mostly men, who were doing the hard work in the steel factories. They were settling in shacks. I read an estimate. It was actually by the sisters who were setting up the kindergarten, that there were something like 200 bars in this area of tar paper shacks. And they're like, well, heck, if we want to civilize this, we need to make it someplace that is going to foster children and is going to be a good place for women and children. That will civilize Gary, Indiana. So they started with a kindergarten there with the help of the Presbyterian Church. The picture on the right is a picture that I took last month, actually, at the Hull House Museum. Just quick show of hands. How many of you are familiar with Hull House? Thank goodness, because none of my students and nobody in my family knows what it is. I'm like, I'm going down to Hull House, and they're like, what now? So it's now a museum, right? Very famous settlement house we'll get to and talk a little bit later. And there's a big sign there right above what is now the bookstore that says this. It has the name of the woman, which I can't quite read from here. Opened a kindergarten in this room in 1889, I believe. So that one's in Chicago. So we have women prioritizing, let's have education for children. Let's teach people how to read. And Hull House was, again, it was not established in a nice neighborhood. It was essentially the slums, right? So let's promote this idea of educating children, teaching them how to read so that they will have a better life and so that they can then contribute more for themselves and for their communities. Kari, I didn't take a look at the time when I started. How are we?
We have about 35 minutes left.
Perfect. Okay. The third part along these lines has to do with the traveling libraries here in Wisconsin. And I don't think Wisconsin was the only state to do this, but certainly as a state with more of a rural population, you know, we had Andrew Carnegie, who about 10 years from now, roughly, would start really funding brick and mortar libraries in cities, several of which are in Wisconsin. But for your more rural areas, it didn't make sense to jump in the cart or on a horse and ride to the city. So we had these libraries that, I think I have a picture here. Yep. These boxes, essentially, that would travel from town to town. And this was actually supported through the state legislature, but at the local level, it was women's organizations that would make sure that the books got around and people got a chance to see them. And if you look, I actually got these pictures from the Wisconsin Historical Society site. There's just rules there in terms of, you know, you can take a book, but you have to bring it back, you have to sign out the book, etc. So, women's philanthropy, women's voluntary action for the public good, coalesced around literacy, particularly in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. So now I'm going to go on and talk about settlement houses, which were more in the early 20th century, and it's a topic that really came about from the idea of welcoming immigrants and welcoming migrants. So immigrants typically, well, from Eastern Europe, also from Southern Europe, people who would arrive, and of course there were waves of migration. You would tend to see people coming from similar towns to similar places in the U.S., but often you would have people arriving who didn't have any network here and maybe didn't speak English and maybe, you know, could be a laborer but didn't have other types of job skills that were needed in that area. So Jane Addams and her good friend Ellen Gates Starr started Hull House in 1889. This really was a new movement because Jane Addams was a fairly well-to-do woman. She wasn't a Rockefeller, but she had some money, and she chose to use it to say, you know what? What if instead of just turning people out onto the streets, and certainly in Chicago, as in many cities, it was men would often become laborers. Young women who came often had a very different fate, right? Trying to support their family members and themselves. And she and Ellen Gates Starr said, you know, let's start a house where not only can people come when they first need to get on their feet, but we and our friends will live there as well. So we'll be welcoming people not just with a hot meal, but with our presence. And if they need to learn English, we can do that. If they need to learn to cook with the ingredients we have here, we can do that. And theirs actually got quite expansive. I had not realized until I went down to visit. I had thought that it was just a building. Turns out it was like a full block. And they had a women's club and a men's club and a theater group. They actually helped kick off the idea of community theater, which, I mean, they're written about in theater history books all over the country. The idea that theater and music and the arts are not just for people who come from wealth, right? So it's, again, education, but it's in a much more holistic setting, right? And by 1900, so 11 years after they founded Hull House, it became a movement. There were over 100 settlement houses. I have that picture there of Gary Neighborhood House. That kindergarten became a settlement house, welcoming people who were immigrants, and then eventually welcoming people who were migrants, part of the Great Migration. This is the front page of the Gary Tribune on May 9th, 1910. You can see how influential Hull House was. Well, kind of. This is a picture from microfiche. Y'all probably all remember microfiche. Which I am not aware of any Broadway musicals that refer to microfiche, so if you know one, let me know. The resolution isn't great, but you can see the influence, right? When they went to open Gary Neighborhood House, the newspaper headline was, "This is going to be Gary's Hull House," Gary, Indiana's Hull House. I will tell you, I cut this off. The story immediately to the left of this story was announcing that King George and Queen Mary were ascending to the throne over in the UK. So quite a lot going on May 9th, 1910. I had always thought, I'd known about settlement houses. This is why I'm shaking my head at my students and my family, all of whom I have apparently failed. But I always thought that they were just early 20th century, right? Like progressive era. I thought, well, what happened to them? I guess they just faded away. And they did adapt over time, but they adapted differently. If you go, this is a landmark designation plaque outside the Hull House Museum, says it was active from 1889 to 1963. Right? The picture right next to it is a picture from the Gary Neighborhood House archives that was taken in 1964. They were still active. They didn't disband until the early 70s. And in both cases, if you look at them, how did they adapt? Well, the programming adapted. As you had immigrants from different countries coming in, and then that gave way to the waves of the Great Migration. Again, this is something that, I had always learned, okay, we had the Civil War, and then we had Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement, and what happened in between, I have no idea. Well, the Great Migration, right? So we had people moving up from the South, people who had formerly been enslaved, moving up to cities in the North, and the settlement houses were already set up to welcome people, right? So they wound up adapting programs to fit the needs of the communities as they were. But there were a couple of things that really wound up doing them in. One was this idea of urban renewal, the idea of we're going to knock down slums, which were exactly the neighborhoods in which these settlement houses had been set up. And the other one had to do with a great deal of volatility in federal policy, right? And so I know it was the case with Neighborhood House, and it looks like it was also the case with Hull House, that they decide, you know what, this is still something we care about, they being the boards of directors, the people who were working there, people who had helped to professionalize social work as a calling that was started off being more volunteer and then became more professional, had more training. By the way, early name for social work, philanthropy. Indiana University had a school of philanthropy that was its school of social work. Now it has a school of philanthropy in the modern sense. And so wound up taking these ideas and moving them to different brick and mortar, different kinds of programs, right? So this brings us to the third, and you'll see there are some bridges across these three buckets that I've chosen to focus on, which is the development of social sciences. And if this one comes as a little bit of a shocker, you're not alone. And if you're not surprised, I'd love to hear what you're thinking later. Well, I'll focus on two main characters here. You know, I think our expectations for photography have changed over the years. Both of these women wind up looking very severe, and I suspect that they probably weren't nearly as severe in real life. Margaret Olivia Sage, so she founded the Russell Sage Foundation, and at this point, the idea of a foundation, a charitable foundation, something that has a lot of money in investments so that you are living off the endowment and you are spinning off money to be used charitably, potentially forever, is really pretty new. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, I forget which Rockefeller, I think David Rockefeller wound up managing it, but I forget which Rockefeller actually established the Rockefeller Foundation. They were early on the ground. Right there with them was Margaret Olivia Sage. One of the reasons I love this story is that Russell, her husband, who predeceased her, she established the foundation in his honor after he passed away. He was stingy. He did not like giving to philanthropy. I see this as revenge philanthropy, because she established this charitable foundation and named it after him. I'm sure they loved each other very much. And the purpose for doing this, in her mind, was for the improvement of social and living conditions in the United States. This is lofty, but think about it. You have Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford establishing these things. Okay, Ford, there's some thought that maybe that was to keep the stock in the family without having to pay taxes on it, but you know, still. For the first time, these are people who are like early industrialists. These are people who are among the first in the country to have this kind of wealth, this kind of economic power. And if you have that, why not have a lofty goal? And with that early industrialization, here's where that management department tie-in comes, all right? With that early industrialization comes the idea of not only scientific management, we should make sure that we're doing this efficiently, but then the idea of scientific philanthropy. Why should we just give out lunch if we can affect nutrition on a broader scale? Why should we just give shelter if we can affect housing policy? Why should we just pass out Band-Aids if we can affect living conditions that affect health outcomes? Very ambitious. And so her early focus with this foundation low-income housing, social work, urban planning, and labor reform. Perhaps surprising choices, and choices that I dare say Mr. Carnegie and Mr. Rockefeller would not have gone with, at least looking at the newspaper clippings of the time. And this developed to the point that the Russell Sage Foundation, do we have anybody who was in the social sciences faculty here or elsewhere? Okay. The Russell Sage Foundation is known as one of the foremost funders of social science, not just the studies, but thinking about how do we research people? How is researching people different from researching rocks or researching rockets? People change their minds a lot more, don't they? And so the Russell Sage Foundation, through its funding, started with this focus on social issues and then said, we need to develop this scientifically. Because Mrs. Sage decided to start a foundation and name it after her husband, who would have used the money quite differently. And we are back to Jane Addams. Because not only did she start an entire movement with this idea of living with people, instead of giving to, living with, being with, she decided, well, heck, let's try and reform policy. So she helped found the National Child Labor Committee. She helped establish the School of Social Work at the University of Chicago. It's not as well known as the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, I grant you, but it's where she was. And while she was there, so the University of Chicago is well known for its sociology department. Some of the earliest thinkers in American sociology were at the University of Chicago, George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman, and she was there talking with them at the time. Now, at that point, sociologists were all about, well, let's come up with grand theories. And here she is marching in with tables of data that she has painstakingly collected. They were like, that's nice, Jane, but it's not sociology, it's not theory. Well, the irony here is if you look at sociological papers today, it's all about the numbers. So Jane has had an effect there. But she was really ahead of her time. Now, this really dreadful picture to the left is another one that I took. So we're sensing several themes in this talk, aren't we? Hull House maps and papers. It doesn't necessarily sound like a page turner until you get the context that the United States Congress in late 1900s decided for the first time to do a survey of the poor areas, what are often called slums in major cities. And for Chicago, they approached Hull House and they said, would you run the project for Chicago? If you make it down to the museum, and hot tip, this would be a wonderful field trip. If you make it down to the museum, then you will see a model that was built that shows for each housing unit up and down the streets of this area. Are you trying to tell me something, Kari? Oh, okay. That you will see, like, there's data on what was the household income for that housing unit. What's the race and ethnicity of the people living there? What are the occupations of the people there? How many people are living there? And it was the first time this kind of data had been collected. They compiled it into a report, and you can see that they gave the credit to all of the residents of Hull House. They compiled it into a report, and it was one of the very first documents that suggested that somebody who is born into an urban slum is starting life in a different place than somebody who was born into a suburb, right? So this was groundbreaking at the time. I mean, right now we have the U.S. Census that collects a lot of this information. But they were among the first to do it, and the women at Hull House were tasked with Chicago. So then, to kind of close the loop a little bit, as much as I enjoy looking at, what is distinctive about the way that women's philanthropy has influenced the development of the whole country, and certainly of academic disciplines as well, right? So what does women's philanthropy look like today? Well, let's just start really generally. This data is about 1 year old, and this pie chart tells us that in 2023, about $557 billion was given by Americans to charities. And of that, 67% was given by people who are alive, and another 8% came through wills. So people, but after they'd passed. The 19% is by foundations, the 7% by corporations. If you look at the headlines, you might expect that foundations and corporations would be a bigger part of the pie. But more than almost 3/4 of it is by people. More than half of households give to charities. And when we look at demographic patterns, more likely to give if you're older, if you have higher income. I'll bet that's a shocker. If you have higher wealth. Also, if you're married or widowed, people who are single are less likely to give charitably. The average gift per household, if you just do a straight average, $2,500. But if you look at the median, so like what's the middle, line them all up in numerical order and look in the middle, it's about $900 per household. So the average American household gives almost $1,000 per year. So that's generally. What's distinctive about women donors? Well, certainly compared to the 18th century and the 19th century and the early 20th century, you see that women's share of wealth has gone up significantly. Not least, every year I take a look at, it's called the Philanthropy 50. It's the people or couples who have given the greatest amount of money in the previous year. And time was, if you saw a woman on that list, her wealth came either through inheritance or came through her husband. And he had passed, so inheritance, right? And we're seeing more women working higher wage jobs. So you're still likely to see inheritance, but you're also seeing stuff where this was this woman's line of work and income that she made. Now, in households, obviously, many women are married, right? And in households, about 60%, you have both partners deciding together. But we're also seeing, and this is looking across several different kinds of family settings, that in families where only one partner decides, more often than not, it's the women. It's the woman who decides. It's pretty close, though. 12% men, 15% woman only. And in about 10% of the cases, the partners are deciding separately without really coordinating. We also see that when you control for income levels, you control for generation and race, not only are women more likely to say yes to a charitable appeal, increasingly they're more likely to make larger gifts. Now, obviously, these are generalizations. So it doesn't track for each individual person. But we also see that women tend to give to different charities than men do. Their motivations to give tend to be a little bit different, the kinds of causes they support, etc. Women, there's a phenomenon that has been getting more popular over the past, 10 years or so, called giving circles. I don't know if any of you might be members of a giving circle. The idea being it's a social event. You get together with your other members and everybody chips in. Often it's something like $1,000 buy-in. And then you have, as a group, a great deal more money than you would have if you were doing it yourself. And you get to decide, how are we going to give this? It doesn't have to be 1,000, could be 100, could be whatever the group decides. And so they'll often, go out to research on different organizations, they'll decide on priorities, and they'll vote. So, and giving circles, I think I saw something like 70% of them tend to be women. It tends to have that kind of a presence. So, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention, perhaps you've heard of MacKenzie Scott or Melinda French Gates. Both of them are famous in part because of who they married and divorced. MacKenzie Scott was married to Jeff Bezos, I think, and Melinda French Gates, of course, was married to Bill Gates, who, by the way, was not at all charitable before they got married. And that's how long I've been working in the field, is I remember people saying, oh, Bill Gates has a lot of money, why don't we go ask him? I was like, yeah, he doesn't give to anything. That's changed, largely due to Melinda. So MacKenzie has made a big splash by giving huge sums of money, often to smaller organizations, without strings attached. And that's very uncommon if you have mega donors, right? If you have people who have a lot of money, just think about it yourself. If you were going to give a really big gift somewhere, you're more likely to say, I want it to accomplish this specific thing, versus if you're just like responding to a letter and you're like, yeah, take my $25, do what you do, right? So it's really unusual that she's giving these very large gifts and saying, you guys are the experts. Use it in the way that you think is best. Now, it would be wrong to generalize. She's a single individual, but she's caused a lot of chatter. Melinda French Gates, of course, just divorced Bill, and they split up the assets of their foundation. And she has announced that she's going to be very intentional about deciding what she's supporting. And increasingly, she said, you know what, it looks to me like if we look across different types of organizations, ones that focus on women and girls are not raising the same kinds of money. And I want to help and step up and address that. Now, again, these are just two people who are fabulously wealthy but are not most of us. So I can't generalize there. But I wanted to try and tie things together. We see across history, we see examples of women volunteering and teaching and welcoming. I was like, let's try and get verbs here. Developing programs, adapting strategies. We see a large religious influence, which again, I don't think was necessarily gendered, but women did work so much through churches, certainly, especially in the early days. We then see women really pushing for systematic study of social issues. So we're not going to ignore it. We're not going to just try and patch it. We're going to try and be scientific about this, and then funding them. Currently, we see that women in interviews that have been done with large women donors, they tend to stress things like, I want to understand the problem. I don't want to just write a check. I want to actually work with you to try and address systems. Tend to really focus on this idea of social contact, and tend to, at least the ones who make headlines or get interviewed, tend to say, you know what, I really want to see what's not in the spotlight. And then I trust you guys to be the experts. So, and again, that's not necessarily everybody, right? But some trends that we see. So at this point, I am going to stop talking. And I would love to hear what you see. That's not a picture I took.